Okay. Right. And how's everyone been otherwise?
Great, you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's exciting about it. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, sort of. Well, we'll talk about it in a sec, I guess. But yeah, it seems like there's things happening at our end in Australia, so it's slow progress. But yeah,
great.
it's
Here comes Eric.
Hi, Sean. We haven't actually seen you face to face.
No, this is true. It's always online. Well, yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello there.
Yeah,
That
Eric.
camping guy down there, them in the wilderness.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and do the intro and we'll just dive into an organic conversation. Does that sound okay to everybody?
Okay.
Absolutely.
Welcome to our podcast. My name is Keely Severson and I am here with my co-hosts Alicia Swami and Eric Johnson, and we are exposing mold. Today, our special guests are Sean and Caleb. Sean and Caleb, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
What do we have the pleasure to owe this conversation? I'm not familiar with either of you, so I'd love to learn about both of your roles in the mold industry.
You go first, Caleb.
Well, I'm an admin of Toxic Mold Support Australia. Been admin for nearly 8 years. Yeah, nearly 8 years. So I joined the group because I first discovered I read Surviving Mold in 2006. I have CFS, and I did the VCS test and failed it, but there was no other testing available. So, it kind of went to a dead end. And then in 2014, I read that there was testing available in Australia for the Shoemaker panel, and I redid the VCS and still failed it. So I sort of got interested in Shoemaker's work again and found the group that had started 1 year prior. And yeah, and so since then I did the website. And sort of I work for some organizations like ICI, and I work with Dr. Sandeep Gupta. And yeah, and now there's a biotoxin committee that is starting, a government committee starting next week to develop guidelines for general practitioners. And also there's a targeted call for research into biotoxin illness also, which is up to a $2 million Australian grant for sort of biomedical research into CIRS and biotoxin illness. So that's happening as well.
And my background's quite similar in terms of coming to it as a patient as well. So I was diagnosed with CIRS in 2019 following a roof leak. And basically, I started to get involved with the support group with Caleb, Toxic Mold Support Australia. I had the advantage of being based at a university doing a PhD, and so I had access to the academic literature. And we started sort of working together to produce some of the material that you actually find on the website there. And I guess it's just sort of been one of these situations where, yeah, it's more and more opportunities sort of seem to be coming along to sort of get involved. So right now there's sort of talks as well as to the possibility of even the first patient-led study in Australia happening in the future. And yeah.
Perfect. Now, Caleb, you were talking about how you guys actually are going to research this. So did your organization get a $2 million grant, or maybe you can just talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. No, I mean, Toxic Mold Support Australia is a volunteer organisation. It's basically a Facebook group and a website. What is happening is, so the government is gives out grants for targeted areas of research. So through researcher at Macquarie University, Professor Giles Ullman, he and there's another group called PANDIS, PANDIS. They're going to apply for the grant. It has to be a major university or other research institution to get the grant. So through them, I think Sean and myself are going to help with the grant writing, and I think it'll look up biomarkers. There's a lot of experts on board. Dr. Shoemaker has been approached and is willing to help. So there's a lot of experts. So the grant application is out there, so we'll be applying for the grant. So probably end of the year, start of next year, we'll find out if the grant's been successful, and then it'll be, some years before the publications come out. But there is some things in place already that the researchers have started doing. They've done some preliminary biomarker testing as well.
Wonderful. And you said Dr. Shoemaker is joining you guys. You do know that he's saying mold is not the cause of CIRS. It's only about 7%, and it's actinomycetes. That worries me a little bit, that if he is going to help you on your research, I don't know if that might sway.
Yeah, he's not going to be a primary investigator, so he's just going to be one of the experts that is on board. And I think they'll be looking at transcriptomics, but they'll also be looking at mycotoxin testing. So it's going to be fairly broad in the biomarkers.
Great, awesome. Well, so what is the goal exactly of the research? So you're going to do this research to give it to the Australian government to, all right, recognize this as an issue so doctors can start treating people?
So, well, it might be worth going back and sort of telling a little of the history here of how that sort of $2 million of funding came about, I guess. And you actually have to go back really to about 2015. And one of our federal members of parliament, the Honourable Lucy Wicks, a tree basically fell on the roof of her home, and she subsequently got very, very sick. And she went through basically, many doctors trying to find an answer. And eventually her mother said, actually, you need to be looking into mold. And she was given a diagnosis of CIRS and kind of realized that in Australia, just like the US, just like so many countries, this is a very poorly recognized illness. There's a lot of pushback from the medical community about this illness as well. And she wound up kicking up a bit of a fuss about it, and that led in 2018 to a federal inquiry into biotoxin-related illnesses. And so that had input from medical experts, other professionals, patients, as well as our Department of Health, and our Royal Australian College of Physicians and the like. And it was a mix, really. It kicked off a lot of events. The chief medical officer of the country at the time basically said, we recognize that sort of these people with these sort of CIRS-like conditions, that they are genuinely physically ill, and that we've probably acted very poorly in the past because we've just said, oh no, it's psychosomatic. We do recognize they're genuinely physically ill. However, we do not think there is enough evidence to say that it's actually dampness and mold causing their illness. And they even said some things like, well, we also think that there's really only a small amount of evidence, mainly coming from one research team in the US, and that they were basically referring to the Shoemaker team. Regardless, the committee that sort of oversaw that inquiry basically handed down a number of recommendations that the Australian government now has to sort of respond to and follow out. And that's what you're sort of hearing about now in terms of this $2 million of funding and the like. So part of this that's going on is the Department of Health is going to be conducting a full literature review on the topic. So when the chief medical officer actually stood up and sort of made those comments that were a little bit dismissive, we actually know from a freedom of information request that they had not actually conducted a literature review before making those comments. And then we have the Australian government's National Health and Medical Research Council. And so this is the primary sort of health and medical funding council of Australia. And they actually produced an initial consultation paper on this, and they actually did basically a sort of small, an initial literature review on this topic. And they actually rebutted the Department of Health and said, contrary to what was heard at the biotoxin inquiry, there is a growing body of evidence for this illness, and cited a whole bunch of studies around that. And that was very, very promising indeed. That's probably the first government report we sort of really know of that has at least said, right, there is evidence this illness is real, and there is evidence that it's actually being caused by dampness and mold. So that's progress, really. So from that comes this targeted call for research, $2 million of funding that now academics around the country can apply for to do further research into this. There's a few other initiatives that sort of come around it as well. Department of Health has a few other recommendations that they have to respond to, such as sort of putting out information to the public about this topic, which they haven't done yet. Caleb, I think you know some of the other recommendations better than me. So what would they be?
Well, I'll just give you the targeted call for research. I'll just give you their objectives. I put it in the chat, but so the three main objectives: develop a scientifically valid, evidence-based understanding of the pathophysiology and etiology of CIRS and other biotoxin-related illnesses. Establish a case definition for CIRS and other biotoxin-related illnesses that will guide testing and diagnosis, including the identification of potential biomarkers, and develop an evidence base that will underpin treatment and management strategies. So that's the main thing. But it's really interesting. One thing it will not support is research into the prevalence of dampness and mold in the built environment. So it's more strictly biomedical.
It sounds like it's more aimed at investigating CIRS and less aimed at investigating mold specifically. And the reason that's concerning is Shoemaker has actually made a pivot from connecting CIRS to endotoxins. So I would hate to see this move in a direction where all this research is basically proving CIRS is not mold illness. That would be an awful direction for this to go.
Yeah. I mean, they are using the term CIRS and biotoxin-related illnesses, which is what was used in the government inquiry. But
did you see the Mycotoxins summit where Shoemaker spoke recently, like last week, where he was kind of indicating, well, flat out saying that the genetic failures from his profile were actually activated by endotoxins, actinomycetes, and not.
Yeah, we're aware of that.
Still saying there's about a 10% mycotoxin component. But I would say most of the research in the area is still on mold. So one of the literature review will find mostly mold-centric research.
That's the point. And that's the sort of, that's been part of the pushback and the sort of differentiation you have to make around where the evidence is at right now. So when people talk about CIRS, that's a particular syndrome for identifying and diagnosing individuals, whereas in general, and there's only a sort of limited amount of research about that, and so we do see a lot of pushback from the medical community about that. In general, you can sort of pull back from there to the broader lens, which is what is the evidence that dampness and mold cause innate immune activation? And that includes a much broader body of evidence. That's not just CIRS, but that's all those other researchers who have specifically looked into mold and Stachybotrys and the like as well. And right now, the sort of, having sort of talked to some of the other researchers in this space, like Dr. Cheryl Harding and the like, their position is that the evidence for that general causation is actually growing reasonably strong now. And so that's where we sort of have to direct this biotoxin illness advisory committee and the like, and direct this literature review to sort of recognizing that. Because if you can just push to where that evidence is at now, in recognizing that, yes, these people are genuinely ill, and yes, it's being caused by dampness and mold. I think, yes, Shoemaker is his ECS, he's pointing, saying, oh, I think it's endotoxins and actinomycetes. He's one researcher out of many. We really have to see what others come along and say about that. It's true that there is an existing body of literature around endotoxins causing neurodegeneration, but we haven't really seen those two bodies of literature, the dampness and mold and that endotoxin causing neurodegeneration, really linked together in a compelling way yet, I'd say.
Great. And so really the goal probably of just this overarching research is to establish some sort of exposure minimums in buildings or air quality standards or anything like that? Is that kind of like the goal?
Well, from them saying they don't want to look into the built environment, I'm not sure how much. I think the research that Pandas will be doing I'm not sure what they can include, but I mean, they are thinking about, the built environment and testing for the built environment. I'm not sure how much they'll be able to do with that, with this grant specifications, but I mean, that's half the, that's 50% of the issue is the building. So you can't really have one without the other.
Great. Eric, go for it.
I was just going to say that Dr. Shoemaker's change in position has put everybody in a very interesting position, because from 2001, with his first book on the subject desperation medicine, up until actually the art and science of CIRS, he's pretty much been leaning towards connecting his paradigm CIRS with toxic mold exposure and chronic fatigue syndrome. And yet he has turned around and now stated that he wants to separate chronic fatigue syndrome from CIRS, which, and combining this with his change in focus to actinomycetes and subtraction of that on toxic mold, it creates a scenario where if you were diagnosed with CIRS under the "we think it's mold" era, now the very same term is probably not mold. How can that fail to create confusion?
I think you're right in some ways. I think the way I see it is, it's from your perspective, you'd like to say, okay, right, there's a lot of compelling evidence outside of Shoemaker around Stachybotrys, and B, there was several studies early on in the CFS story linking mold, particularly Stachybotrys, to CFS. And it's not as if, we don't recognize, constantly that we see this overlap between the CIRS community and the ME/CFS community, and even perhaps a few other patient communities too. I think, given how it played out here with the biotoxin inquiry and the language that has been, biotoxin related, or the words that the government uses here is they never really quite say CIRS, they actually say CIRS-like syndromes. Is that what we're going to see is, however this plays forward, it'll probably be recognizing those people who just at first, just under that general banner, as we were saying before about dampness and mold, recognizing that they are getting ill from that. And that means it's possible that we'll see this play out where you're going to see a reclassification of a certain amount of the ME/CFS community reclassified as sort of CIRS, if you like. We don't know how that's going to play out. That's a possibility. And yeah, that's problematic because it means that the original ME/CFS community might be the patients remaining whose illness isn't perhaps driven by dampness and mold. I still think there's an element there where we can get focused too much on Shoemaker because he was the originator of CIRS. But as I'd say before, I think we're still waiting to see how other researchers follow up on his transcriptomics test suggesting that it is endotoxins and actinomycetes and the like. I don't know, Caleb, you got thoughts on this?
Well, Shell Harding had a lovely paper last year that showed innate immune activation in an animal model with spores from Stachybotrys and denatured spores, so without the toxin, so just fungal fragments, causing similar neuroinflammation and cognitive and behavioral issues in mice. So that's a nice cause and effect model. There's a lot, I mean, and the researchers in Finland are using dampness and mold's hypersensitivity syndrome. So they're, you know, quite mold
That's also the
focused.
terminology the World Health Organization used in their 2009 review, this dampness and mold banner. And they recognized even then that there were probably multiple elements to it, synergistic elements that we sort of don't understand in terms of perhaps interaction between different inflammagens, whether mycotoxins or even just the fungal fragments themselves or even other components in a water damaged building, and that we haven't actually understood those synergistic elements yet. And I don't think Shoemaker's research has elucidated that yet either. But sorry, I'll throw it back to you, Kelly.
Yeah, I mean, there's, you know, beta glucans, mannans, endotoxins, exotoxins, you know, I mean, I think with the actinobacteria, it's not fully elucidated if it's endotoxins, exotoxins, or the actual actinobacteria itself. And actinobacteria is actually quite a big family of bacteria. Actinomycetes are actually a genus under that. So it's basically bacterial,
Can I ask you guys a question? This is just a curiosity question. Like, I feel like a little kid pulling on your shirts, but I have a question. How are they saying that mycotoxins are less than 7% of CIRS when mycotoxins inside of a home cannot be adequately assessed for, and none of Shoemaker's tests are showing anything about mycotoxins? So I'm confused.
Shoemaker's looking at the transcriptome, which is the messenger RNA of patients, and he's basically seeing what targets. So looking at the RNA and going back to the literature, seeing what pathogens target those sections of RNA. So he says they're ribotoxins, so they target the ribosome, which is the manufacturing power, you know, they manufacture the proteins in a cell. So he's saying ribotoxins related to actinobacteria correlate in patients, but he's not. And also he's just come up with a actinobacteria index for the home, which looks at actinobacteria. There's group 1 and group 2. It's kind of like a sort of a mimic of the OMI. Group 1 are pathogenic or human actinobacteria. Group 2 are soil-based actinobacteria. So he hasn't, you know, it's pretty gray at the moment, you know, because he's traditionally used the Yermi and Hertzme, which is obviously fungal based. So he's trying to marry the new Genie test with this new actinobacteria test, but I don't think there's anything published that's quite solid that this shows the connection as yet.
I see that Lucy Wicks has resumed much of her former duties and is going in and out of buildings and interacting in a much more normal way. How is she doing these days?
I actually couldn't tell you. She seems to have been pretty quiet on the issue since the biotoxin inquiry. I don't know if Caleb said anything more.
She was, yeah, I think she's, I mean, she seems to be, yeah, resumed duties. Apparently she was carrying an Air Oasis unit with her into different parliamentary rooms for a while. So I'm not sure if she's still doing that. But I think she's, yeah, I mean, publicly, I don't think we've had an update, but just from her parliamentary and work, she seems to be, full-time working.
Well, I corresponded with Lucy Wicks prior to the Australian parliamentary inquiry, and she invited me to submit my testimony, which is the story basically in Mold Warriors and Surviving Mold, of actually having started the chronic fatigue syndrome for the purpose of getting research into the toxic mold, which we found to be Stachybotrys chartarum. And I did submit my testimony, and their secretaries and the members of the committee saw it, and yet there was no mention that they were aware of the connection between toxic mold and chronic fatigue syndrome, even though this is clearly outlined in Shoemaker's books. You have any comment on that?
Your submission isn't on the official submissions page, so I'm not sure what happened there.
Interesting, because I received a receipt personally from the secretary of the committee. So somehow that must have gotten set aside. But anyway, as you know, my goal in volunteering to become a prototype for the original Holmes 1988 chronic fatigue syndrome was so that we wouldn't have these years of delay in studying these matters. And I realize now that they say that they've redefined chronic fatigue syndrome and it's moved on since then, but they haven't really addressed the fact that the original syndrome was actually directly based on toxic mold and can't be set aside without clearing up this confusion. Do you anticipate in the future that they'll revisit these matters?
I think it will. It's just the way, I guess, we see it playing out is it's going to be the reverse of the way that you would like. So it definitely was an oversight that we had. Those early studies on that were never followed up. I know there's been reports from a number of researchers during that sort of period where it was just seemed like any funding on this was blocked. Like people just couldn't get grants, they couldn't follow it up at all. And it got left in the dust, and people were instead pursuing the whole sort of post-viral syndrome, if you like, the virus aspect. So it was an oversight. It wasn't handled well, and it's been far too long, obviously, and we're all aware of that. Like we've had obviously something like 36 years since CFS was coined or the like, and really 50 years of sick buildings, and it's a disgrace that this hasn't been better addressed, obviously. I think for us, the difference, it's not that we disagree about the dangers of mold in general or Stachybotrys specifically. It's more the way it's played out in Australia has been that rather than ME/CFS being linked to toxic mold here, it has been this biotoxin inquiry, and this is the language they're using instead, this biotoxin and CIRS-like syndrome. So we have to sort of go along that path as well and take that in good faith for now. And it does mean, sort of as I was saying before, that it's more likely to be a reverse situation where we recognize something like a CIRS-like syndrome, and then perhaps increasingly a number of people with ME/CFS realize that their illness is being driven by dampness and mold. And that does mean that the original name that was coined for this is potentially, not the one that's eventually connected with toxic mold, even though it should have been.
Well, there was a separate Australian parliamentary inquiry into ME/CFS.
Yep.
And I noticed that they didn't look into the history of either myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. And it's not just Australia. Researchers all the way around the world are kind of playing the same game, like the ones at Stanford. They're talking about redefining ME/CFS. And I'm not sure how that's going to be possible, because myalgic encephalomyelitis was coined by Atchison and Ramsey back in 1955 for the Royal Free Hospital outbreak, which had a very specific data set, but no mention of sick building syndrome or mold whatsoever. And chronic fatigue syndrome was based directly on the 1985 Lake Tahoe mystery illness outbreak, in which all the clusters were in sick buildings, and we did document Stachybotrys. So we've got a disparity of data sets that means you can't really combine ME/CFS, and any attempt to redefine it and move on would be in defiance of science. It would be trying to subvert the evidence that we'd long had.
I mean, so the Biotoxin Advisory Committee they're doing a review, like outsourcing it to a third party. So the terms of references conduct a review into the treatment of patients presenting with complex illnesses that are difficult to diagnose, including biotoxin-related illnesses and those with CIRS-like conditions, and develop clinical guidelines for GPs for the diagnosis, treatment, and management of CIRS-like conditions in consultation with patient groups, medical practitioners, and health bodies. So, I mean, CIRS-like conditions and complex illnesses that are difficult to diagnose, surely that will, ME-CFS will be one of those. I'm not sure how far they're going to go down that research path.
I think we can see already what they're planning to do. It's going to be a replay of the 2015 Institute of Medicine attempt to redefine ME-CFS to the total exclusion of the original outbreaks that both ME and CFS were based on.
So what has Dr. Shoemaker said about CFS and CIRS? What you said that he's trying to...
Yeah, it's a really interesting situation. You know, he flew me out to the 2019 Fort Lauderdale, Florida Mold Congress to speak about mold at ground zero for chronic fatigue syndrome. So I anticipated at that time that all the Shoemaker doctors would be on board with proceeding with establishing this direct connection. And then we could clear up some of this confusion, kind of figure out what differences or similarities there are between his entity of CIRS and chronic fatigue syndrome. And yet, I guess the genie testing negated his proposed connection of CIRS and chronic fatigue syndrome, because he kind of backed away from attempting to connect it with chronic fatigue syndrome, and actually wrote in the Art and Science of CIRS that this should be kept as a separate entity. And that's a bit confusing, because for nearly 20 years, he was working towards creating a connection between the two. And now Dr. McMahon and Dr. Shoemaker are saying it should be kept separate, which is fine. But as long as we go back and establish what chronic fatigue syndrome is and what CIRS is, so that we can find out why they should be separated now.
It's hard to know Shoemaker's motivations without actually sort of talking to him about it. I guess there's no doubt that, I don't know.
I think I can explain that, actually. And you can get clues from Cheryl Harding's work, because in 2015, she ran into the situation where Stachybotrys that had been stripped of its mycotoxins still elicited a damaging response, a pulmonary hemorrhage, in fact. So this was the first really clear evidence we had that the structure of Stachybotrys, even without the toxins, is still capable of causing this kind of damage. And I told Dr. Shoemaker that even though his focus on mycotoxins may have been subtracted by the genie testing, that this pathological response to the structure itself indicates that we should continue looking into Stachybotrys, because there's clearly some kind of pathology involved.
Yeah, look, and I think there's going to be ongoing research of that. Cheryl Harding's team has continued to focus on Stachybotrys, obviously, with more recent circumstances. I think we've sort of been trying to say here is that this is one researcher who's doing it, and I think as the Shoemaker's team who are focusing sort of elsewhere around this, it's not the whole, it's not every researcher who's doing that. More than this, it's hard to know the entirety of the politics around the situation when it seems as if governments don't wish to fund research into this, which means that perhaps the research naturally leads in ME-CFS towards more viral syndromes or viral elements being investigated instead of the fungal elements, for example. So I'm not saying it's ideal, and I'm not saying it's they've done it right. It's more saying, I guess here in Australia, we're rolling with how it has played out and sort of acting in good faith for now with the government in terms of what they've done and how they've structured the language. So I do take your point. I just think it's a difficult situation given not everyone's being above board about it all.
And I think I hear what you're saying is you kind of recognize Eric's point, but that's what you have to work with right now to move forward. And you haven't really been set up with the best thing to work with to move forward. And maybe if you had some other researchers who had other data, maybe there would be other projects that you could move forward with in a way that, but you also acknowledge that this could potentially lead mold injured people towards a CIRS diagnosis, which the way this is going legally by their definitions and by their testing could be water damage illness from not mold, but endotoxins. And that could really hurt people's legal cases. This could be a whole shift. This could be a whole shift for like avoiding legal reparation. And you guys could be kind of walking into a trap voluntarily. I hate to say it, but when you look at the bigger picture, you have to look at how all the octopus arms are connected to the octopus.
Well, I think...
Oh, sorry. You go.
I think also we need really good building studies because, you know, is actinobacteria found without, you know, mold? So, you know, will there ever be a case where the Hertzsprung is lot, you know, fine, perfect, but the actinobacteria index is high? Or do they always, I mean, both of them like similar conditions, you know, damp, moisture, you know, same sort of temperatures. So I would imagine that where there is one, there's usually the other. So, and still, even if he's doing the genie testing, I mean, that's, you know, it's still a subclass, like a phenotype of CIRS would still be mycotoxin related. And so 1985 in Lake Tahoe, you know, that could have been all, you know, Stachybotrys related. 36 years later, maybe there's, you know, maybe the fungal and bacterial ecology of environments have changed. But even back then, it could have still been that 8%, you know, Eric could have still been that 8% mycotoxin phenotype of CIRS. Legally, yeah, I mean, we just haven't had really any good research in Australia on this matter at all. Like, it's just all been on asthma.
We're not necessarily attached to like pegging mycotoxins down on this, where Eric has to like prove that it's mycotoxins. It's just that something really specific happened in Lake Tahoe, and when the factors present weren't researched, we can't look at what effects that might have been that could be affecting the environment in an overarching way. Right, Eric?
For me, I'd step back and say, you know, my goal here is, regardless of the specifics of whether it's, you know, Stachybotrys, mycotoxins, endotoxins, or anything, when we look at that general causation of, have we got people in sick buildings, have we got people in water damaged buildings, you know, genuinely, incredibly, ridiculously ill from dampness and mold, that general title, right? For now, I think that's enough. Like, obviously we want to go forward with the research. We want to actually find out exactly what's going on there, right? But for now, we've got enough evidence just for that general banner, dampness and mold, the elements we find in water damaged buildings. What we want to do is just push that forward, because the evidence is strong enough that if we can make that link and we can get the literature review and the sort of biotoxin illness advisory committee that's actually going to be reviewing this over the next 12 months, that would actually be giving a better chance of getting some recognition and helping people with their legal cases. So it's sort of, I'd push back and disagree a little and say, we just need that general causation to be recognized now to actually help with legal cases, because people here have the same problem as in the States, where it's very difficult to get insurance claims. I don't think we've even heard of a single workers' compensation claim that's been won in this country. It's not great, obviously.
The defense expert witnesses are already so aggressively attacking the CIRS claims. We spoke with a fungal geneticist yesterday who was calling the HLA genes quack science because there's multiple genes that are going to be expressed when someone's living in poison and no genetic profile that would be expected to endure it in a healthy manner. And so I'm just letting you know what we see, that, you know, from the legal side, I already see people kind of gearing up to attack this to make it sound like not only is it quack science, not only is it not mold, it's not even genetic.
I mean, the HLA link was one peer-reviewed conference paper. It shows a stronger association. You know, if you have those sort of HLA genes, you're in that 24% of the population. It's something like you're 3.7 times more likely, which isn't to say that other people can't get sick. And no one's followed up with that at all. So it's very easy to push back on that. And we wouldn't even disagree with you there. This harks back to some of the earlier points here saying, CIRS as a syndrome to identify, diagnose, and treat such individuals is far weaker in terms of the evidence, because it does primarily come from that one team, and that one team, some of their studies are quite small, some of their studies are published in questionable journals, quite frankly. But we still have this problem where, okay, we've got that broader body of evidence that says dampness and mold cause innate immune activation, cause sick people. We still need some way to basically identify, diagnose, and treat those people. So we have to sort of move forward from that general causation to getting something in place. So there's no doubt there's quack science, or problematic science anyway. But if we get that first step in place of recognizing, yes, people are getting sick in sick buildings, which should have been done a very long time ago, then we start to get the ball rolling on that further research to actually identify, diagnose, and treat wherever that leads. And we come back to that idea of like a CIRS-like syndrome or a CFS-like syndrome, whatever that is, whatever the best diagnostics are, whatever the best biomarkers are to identify them, and whatever we end up with the best treatment regime for those individuals too.
Well, Dr. Shoemaker,
it's more the way it's played out in this country, and in terms of the way we're sort of rolling with the ball with what's actually happened with this government inquiry and the like.
It's going to be very interesting because Dr. Shoemaker has done such a good job of publicizing my story of mold at ground zero for chronic fatigue syndrome that people are going to read it and they're going to see that there was evidence, documented evidence, that Stachybotrys was the actual first clue in this syndrome. So to move on and proceed as if this matter can never be settled indicates a loss, a breakdown in the methods of science. And I think more and more people are going to be questioning that. And as both Harvard and the Institute of Medicine and the Open Medicine Foundation, Dr. Ron Davis's group, and all the other organizations are attempting to say, well, we will never be able to solve chronic fatigue syndrome. We'll have a growing number of people going, wait a minute, this was never in doubt. We knew about this all along. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the government, the Australian Parliament is going to handle this situation when, if they depend on Dr. Shoemaker's books, they cannot help but study over the story that toxic mold actually started this controversial syndrome.
I think we'll have to see how the Biotoxin Illness Advisory Committee plays out and see, because once we do that complete literature review around that, it's going to encompass all of those studies. We'll just have to see
studies.
Caleb's going to be part of that committee. Dr. Sandeep Gupta is going to be part of that committee. We don't really have a handle on the other 8 members of that committee now, or how they're going to respond to the evidence. So, we're going to have to actually see how they respond to that evidence and then start to actually move on that basis, I guess I'm saying.
The requirement of the National Institute of Health, the NIH, when they put down a directive to the Institute of Medicine to redefine ME/CFS, is they rely only on peer-reviewed literature and nothing else. Well, of course, when you create a syndrome, there's no peer-reviewed literature. That's the reason for creating it, because there is none yet. So by doing this, they were guaranteeing that there would be only aftermarket opinions and distortions and redefinitions, and no actual evidence or epidemiology into the original incident or evidence that was under consideration by the Holmes Committee. So I can see already that this is their plan. By redefining whatever it is, whether it's CIRS or ME/CFS or any name they'd come up with, what they're planning on doing is wiping out evidence of the past so they'll have a clean slate so they can not only absolve themselves of all their malfeasance of the past, but act like whatever they're discovering now is new and discovered by them. Fascinating. Whereas I'm thinking that the patients who see that there's a long track record of evidence for both mold illness that precedes the chronic fatigue syndrome outbreak are going to look at this and go, what the heck are you guys doing?
Yeah, definitely.
Now, the evidence by Cheryl Harding about the particulates, the organic structure of Stachybotrys denuded of the mycotoxins still causes a pathogenic response. Now, it'd be very nice to move forward and say, well, all that old evidence doesn't matter anymore, except what's going to happen when patients find out that the Soviets actually discovered this in 1948?
Stachybotrys toxicosis or another incident?
No, they not only discovered Stachybotrys toxicosis, but by attempting to turn it into a biological warfare agent, they isolated, they purified the toxins by separating it from the structure and found that without the associated structure, it lacked the full effect. So they knew back in 1948 that there was something about the structure of Stachybotrys itself that was required to be inhaled to get the pulmonary hemorrhage.
Look, I think we're all on the same side in just trying to get patients to be treated properly by the medical community and to get a proper treatment and for this incredibly awful situation to end, right? And there's no doubt that games have been played around the science. We absolutely agree. It's not a big deal. And we still don't know the full extent of that. You know, I
agree. I agree. You should absolutely.
Eric, I always agree with the general thing about what you're saying in terms of, why was this overlooked? Why was this missed? Why was Stachybotrys not more focused on in the past? I never disagree about that, and I'm never going to play down mold at ground zero, and I'm also never going to play down your role in helping people when the medical community weren't helping anyone, right? It's more, the only part I do disagree on is simply the current tactics of where we're at and where we have to play this in our country right now, right? Yeah. So you're saying we should have gone back to mold at ground zero and we should have followed that up, and we never did. And yeah, absolutely, we should have done that. That's not how it's playing out. We've got a whole bunch of researchers who've got in their head that ME/CFS is something different, that they're following a different lead. And the bulk of the literature, because of that history, is now in that other direction, away from toxic mold, away from that fungal lead. So they're following that, which means that the people who probably figure this out are going to be outsiders and the like.
And so Keely mentioned that you might be falling into a trap is where this Cheryl Harding evidence with the particulates actually being more responsible for the pathogenesis in the mycotoxin. That means that as they move into studying genetic effects of mycotoxins, they're moving away from finding out that really this is where the pathology is driven.
Oh, sorry, can you spell that out a little?
Yeah, as Cheryl Harding pointed out, the Stachybotrys skeletons, the structure itself that was put in solvents so the mycotoxins were taken away are actually capable of causing the greater portion of the pathogenesis. So by moving into mycotoxins, they might be actually leading you into a trap of saying, well, this is the pathology we associate with mycotoxins, but we don't see any of this other stuff. Whereas actually in the old evidence, this goes back to, like I say, the 1940s. Yeah. So yeah, I agree that you have to move forward with what you've got, but at the same time, we are dealing with some really sneaky, tricky people where they see an advantage of leading you astray and delaying science. They can string you out for years and years and years, whereas I know you have to go ahead and proceed with the peer-reviewed literature, and that's great, and I suggest that you do so. But at the same time, at Exposing Mold, we're going to tell the original story the original evidence and lay it out to the patients so they can make up their own minds as to how science is being handled.
I think we've all got strong opinions on how science is being handled just from the past 18 months of this pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, there hasn't been enough studies into particulate, like fungal particles. Reponin from 2007, fungal fragments in moldy houses, a field study in homes in New Orleans and southern Ohio. That was a good one that showed that exposure might be 500 times higher when fragments are included. Although they were basically still saying that the fragments hold the mycotoxins. So there's probably, not that many peer review that show effects of fungal fragments without mycotoxins, because they usually go together.
And then David Strauss demonstrated that unless you purify vast quantities of air by concentrating the mycotoxins from it, it's below the level of detection. So here's another way they can say, well, we're going to rely on peer-reviewed literature, but by failing to attach importance to the one study that shows that there's something wrong with their theory, they can put off research into it.
Yeah. So I guess I'd say the feedback I have from my friends who are medical doctors in this country is that when they hear about CIRS, they think it's too broad a syndrome, right? It hasn't been drilled down into enough, right? To actually sort of to elicit subgroups within that patient community. And that's probably going to be the case. So we've sort of got, in a water damaged building, you're going to have potentially unique exposures meeting unique genetics leading to clusters of pathologies that we haven't identified. We even see that in general with CIRS, even the biomarkers that are involved with that, some people will present with, say, low vascular endothelial growth factor, and others will present with normal vascular endothelial growth factors, and others will present with high vascular endothelial growth factor. So why are we seeing these sort of discrepancies here? Are these patients all supposed to be in the same group? So yeah, I take your point that we could be led down the garden path in another direction that could delay time. For us, our focus is being, well, yeah, that's true. And we'll probably going forward, we might have to separate out, okay, we've got a group here who are Stachybotrys. Perhaps we do have a group over here who are endotoxins. Perhaps we've got another group or whatever, right? But we just come back to the definitions that were the World Health Organization set out, that others have set out, this general banner that I sort of would like to keep banging on about, that dampness and mold banner of and that general causation of where the evidence is at. Can we say people in water damaged buildings exposed to dampness and mold have innate immune activation? Are they genuinely getting sick? Just making that link right now and keeping it to that link, and that's where the bulk of the evidence lies. That's where, if you look at this entire 500 studies around this, that's the strongest part of the evidence, that general causation right now. If we can just get that, suddenly we start to actually be able to get people making successful claims. No, they might not have specifically proven they're endotoxins or Stachybotrys or whatever, but they're just generally proving, yes, I'm sick from a water damaged building, right? And from there, we also start getting research dollars and the like to actually sort of figure the rest of this mystery out.
Yeah, as a original prototype for chronic fatigue syndrome, I am duty bound. I'm obligated. It's my job. It's my responsibility to tell the truth about the evidence and the circumstances that caused the creation of this syndrome. And Dr. Shoemaker said, examine the methods. Always look at the methods. Don't just accept the conclusions. Look through the means by which researchers arrived at their conclusions. Well, in order to properly study chronic fatigue syndrome, one would have to obviously look at what this syndrome was based on. Actual people, the circumstances, the buildings. They would have to do that, not just rely on the definition. So on that basis, because no researchers ever came back and looked in the sick buildings and found the toxic mold, I can say that as far as the peer-reviewed literature goes, every single study on chronic fatigue syndrome fails the test of science. Every single one.
Look, in science in an ideal world, you're right. I've already said it should have been followed up on. It's just we don't live in an ideal world. So, I respect the approach you're taking. I really do. And I think given your circumstances, you should keep pushing in the direction you're pushing. I also just think it's one of these situations where different teams should push in the direction where the best leads work for them. And for us here in Australia, you know, we would get nowhere banging the drum on ME/CFS and mold right now. So we're pushing in the direction where there is some hope of making progress, and that is down the sort of biotoxin inquiry, the CIRS-related illnesses and the like. So I get I don't disagree with you. It's just a matter of the best tactics for us right now.
Have you reached out to Professor Donald Staines and Sonia Marshall-Gradisnik at Griffith University?
I haven't actually. What's their research?
Dr. Gupta did, but yeah.
They're doing some fabulous work on natural killer cell function and the TRPM transit receptor potential melastatin 3 anomaly, ion channel anomaly in ME/CFS. And they are actually working with Dr. Peterson of Incline Village, the original chronic fatigue syndrome cohort. So yes, this has the potential to establish a direct immune abnormality between the original cohort and what they're seeing in Australia.
Yes, yeah.
It's really exciting research.
No, that is.
And since you see a lot of natural killer cell dysfunction in mold exposure, there's a possible avenue of putting the pieces of the puzzle together.
Mm.
Yeah, I've been following their work. I was actually a participant from 2013 to 2016, but they actually developed a microRNA biomarker panel for ME/CFS, but they've kind of ditched it for the calcium ion channel theory. So,
from what I can tell, the problem goes down to the immune dysfunction is so far buried in some kind of really fundamental process that all we are seeing are the downstream effects. It's really impossible to create a good syndrome definition when basic immune dysfunction can be manifested by whatever secondary infections or opportunistic viruses happen to come along. And this is exactly what happened when the original chronic fatigue syndrome cohort, Dr. Holmes realized that the signs and symptoms were all over the map. And yes, he saw signs of immune dysfunction. So the basic directive of the original Holmes definition was not so much to treat the definition as the be-all of what this illness is. In fact, it instructs doctors, don't do this. Do not consider this loose outline to be what the syndrome is. The patients must be evaluated, and this is only a rational basis for further investigation. And of course, to me, a rational basis would mean look deeper into the illness of the actual study subjects upon which this syndrome was based. And this was never done. So science really fell down on the job, and all they're working now to do is cover up for all the years of confusion that they really deliberately created.
I just want to say that Sean and myself are working on our own sort of literature review called the Biotoxin Research Database, which you can include with the show notes or the YouTube. So it's going to be like studies showing a link, mainly multi-system studies. Basically, we want to get sort of the non-allergy, non-infection studies, which is like the what the mainstream medicine only sees as mold affecting the moment. So non-allergy, particularly multi-system illnesses. So positive studies and also negative studies. So the naysayer studies. So and then sort of commenting on those studies and any conflicts of interest and things like that.
Okay, well, I would advise you as you proceed in watching these committees develop their new definitions to look at the methods and see if what they are defining has any relationship to ME or CFS or CIRS or anything in the past, because they are probably trying to delay looking into certain aspects of both CIRS and ME/CFS for as long as possible. Like the
Mycotoxins. We're aware of the games, even just from you and others that have been played in the US around this issue for a very long time. And very recently, of course, Tamara Tuminen published a paper about the games that are being played around this issue in Finland. So it's happening elsewhere as well. And other researchers like Cheryl Harding said, it's not just those two countries, it's elsewhere too. Here in Australia, we were a little fortunate. Well, Lucy Wicks was unfortunate, but we were a little fortunate that a tree fell on our roof and this whole biotoxin inquiry came about and gave us this opportunity. So for now, the Biotoxin Illness Advisory Committee, yes, we haven't had, the first meeting hasn't happened yet. That's going to happen, is it next week, Caleb?
Tuesday.
Tuesday, there you go. And we have to really see and reevaluate at that point based on the feedback that Caleb and Dr. Sandeep Gupta bring back as to, how is this happening? Is this being done in good faith? Is it being done in not so good faith? What are people in the room like? And make decisions at that point. You might be right, but we're I feel like we're in a little bit of a holding pattern until we know more about this committee and how it's going to actually play out and whether it's a viable pathway forward or not. We have to, for the moment, take it on good faith that they are at least going through the motions of doing this. We don't know.
I appreciate that. You got to play the game.
Yeah. So.
Now, we did that with the original chronic fatigue syndrome cluster. When we saw that the CDC, NIH were playing games with this, we kind of sat back and allowed things to happen, hoping that good researchers would come along later and clear everything up. Yes. And we've wound up with a serious shortage of good researchers.
And look, I think that's, it's been, I don't know.
Well, everyone's scrambling for a good biomarker, like, ME-CFS community is, every week there's a new biomarker that comes out, but nothing ever sticks. So hopefully with mold and dampness and CIRS, we can actually, with this funding, so the pandas will be looking at HLA genes if they get the grant, but also other genes as well.
And as much as Shoemaker has been pushing for CIRS, I think the point we're making is that the dampness and mold cause innate immune activation, that's actually not Shoemaker's angle. That's actually more what Cheryl Harding was saying in hers, that she was saying, right, we have these 3 existing accepted categories of how dampness and mold can cause illness, which is allergy, infectional colonization, and toxicity. And her paper was explicitly arguing, no, we need a 4th category that is innate immune activation, and that's where the bulk of the evidence lies. So I guess it looks for us like, okay, we're using the name CIRS, and we're sort of going along that, but we do recognize the weaknesses in that. And right now, it's more actually really pushing along Cheryl Harding's lines, because that's where we think the strength of the evidence lies, that we push this 4th category to be broadly recognized by the medical profession around innate immune activation.
Yeah, you might want to revert possibly to mold illness, just generic mold illness, because if you look back in the literature, in the 1994 Saratoga Springs Proceedings Manual, the information about the innate immune activation was actually generated in the early 1990s by Bill Sorensen.
I think, look, I don't know that story. No, we've always sort of said CIRS/mold illness in a lot of our literature. And I think the patients, for the most part, are very happy to generally just say mold illness too. And we'll sort of let that play out. Obviously, that runs into problems later on, depending on how Shoemaker's research plays out. So I wouldn't throw out CIRS as a name either, because if Shoemaker turns out to be pushing in the right direction, then CIRS is a name that works regardless of whether it turns out to be predominantly mycotoxins or predominantly endotoxins or something else along those lines. So we use both names. We're happy to use both names. People can put whatever name they want in it. Tamara Tuominen decided she was going to go her own way with a name in sort of Scandinavian countries of DMHS, dampness and mold hypersensitivity syndrome. So long as we pool this research together, all of it together, regardless of the name, that points to the general phenomenon here.
Well, that's what we need to do, is put all the information together.
Yeah.
Look back and not discount old studies just because they were done a long time ago.
And the situation here as well, I'd say, is Like I know, for example, from individuals like Sharon Kramer that even the doctors in the States, some of their medical textbooks had literally sort of the studies that have been completely discredited about this topic. The CDC indirectly funded organizations to put some of those studies into the textbooks. So they've been actively taught that the levels of mold and mycotoxins in a water damaged building can't possibly be high enough to cause illness, which has been discredited so many times as a bad joke. So that means there's an active bias with a lot of US doctors. That's not really so much the situation here. The situation here is simply that most Australian doctors were never trained in this at all. They weren't actively taught the wrong thing. It's more that they just viewed it as some kind of superstition or the like. And when they actually start to realize there is a larger body of literature here than they realize, then they start to actually change their minds about it. That's not to say that there probably wasn't some level of negligence or whatever you want to call it, regulatory capture or something like that at the government level. But certainly that's not as well documented here as in the United States with the games, the sort of ongoing patterns of irregularities that seem to pervade how organizations like the CDC have treated this for 20 or 30 years now. So we're not fighting quite so much against a pre-existing bias here, so much as just educating people, hey, there's a giant body of literature here. Why don't you take a look at this and see what you think, if you like.
Well, I have a serious advantage here because being the subject of a syndrome, my circumstances and my illness is not dependent on peer-reviewed literature. In fact, you cannot demand peer-reviewed literature because there wouldn't be any. That's why the syndrome was created. So the offer I made to the Shoemaker group and to groups around the world is if you want to use this as leverage to force the issue, to say that you have to look at this because it was documented, that offer's still on the table.
I think there's an element where those systemic issues in science we're seeing, where individuals such as yourself went to incredibly great length to be so systematic about this and put it on a platter for doctors and say, look, I isolated Stachybotrys, I went out to somewhere like a desert, showed how close I could get to this and have symptoms, and others have followed in your footsteps. Julie Raymeyer in her book obviously conducted her own very small double-blind randomized controlled trial. Jen Bray's documentary on ME/CFS, she talks about using mold avoidance and actually sort of going from basically being bedbound to sort of running around in the desert and the like. So individuals are showing it, and there's a lack of a link there from these patients to what eventually gets funded and put into research. And even if we looked at COVID, for example, we seem to see it's beyond even that even if you're a frontline doctor, you can't even get attention for funding or research or get regulatory agencies to actually follow up on what you're actually doing. And so it's incredibly problematic. The problems are sort of bigger than any of us.
Incredibly problematic. However,
Yes.
by chance, by an amazing stroke of fortune, I was associated with the original chronic fatigue syndrome cluster. I mean, the first one, the very one that Gary Holmes was called for. And in that cluster, in that room, in that school, we found the toxic mold, and it was found by professional remediators. So this elevates this evidence beyond that of a mere anecdotal story by an individual patient.
It's true.
And I
It's
can
in
take
literature.
this,
Well,
and it's really fantastic because I can go to Stanford, I can go to Harvard, and I can say this, and I go, you really don't have the right to walk away from this evidence because it was documented, it's circumstantial, and this was responsible for the creation of the syndrome. And of course, they try to run from me, but I don't know how fast they can run, but I can run pretty fast too.
Oh, look, no, I'll always agree that what happened here was not what should have happened in the due course of science. And I can't imagine your frustration given it has been 36 years.
It has been a long time, but now we've got Arnold Mann on the job. I mean,
Yeah,
the very
I heard
journalist,
I heard your interview with him.
yeah, he unleashed toxic mold to the world. So this is the guy that made it famous, and he's interested in unveiling how the chronic fatigue syndrome debacle was handled.
I think there's, I've collected a lot of notes on this. This is something I occasionally sort of put sort of well-referenced blogs and things on the Toxic Mold Support Australia website and the like. And this is one that's been on my radar that I have a lot of notes for. You know, there's two separate stories there, whether the pulmonary hemorrhage in infants, that whole story that happened in Cleveland and the way the CDC didn't follow up on that. And of course, the ACOM story and the like, and how that wasn't followed up on by authorities as well. Yeah, look.
As researchers proceed, I think we need to make it clear to them that history is going to be their judge.
Yes. It seems to be just that even when you get scientists doing credible studies and actually doing good science, that it's still at the whim of the regulatory agencies to actually decide whether they're going to pay attention to that science or not. And there's a transparency issue there that we really have to deal with. So it just seems, for example, when we watch from over here how the US is dealing with COVID, it seems that any patented drugs for the use of early treatment of COVID-19 will typically have, say, 1 or 2 medium-sized studies, and suddenly they'll get approved for use, even if they show relatively low efficacy. So the examples there would be a drug like remdesivir. And then if we have drugs that, and I'm not sure if they work, but certainly there are drugs like ivermectin that have been discussed a lot recently, and they'll have 60 peer-reviewed studies that seem to show higher efficacy. And no, they're not perfect studies, but it just gets completely freaking ignored. And I know that there's a double standard there in terms of, this seems to be the pattern now for about 5 different patented drugs versus about 5 different generic drugs that are the same pattern we see over and over again. So it comes back to, okay, we're not going to get anywhere, even if we get good scientists doing good research in this space. We still need to actually address the elephant in the room, and that elephant is, okay, we probably have an element of regulatory capture in our agencies. What do we do about that? Because we can put great science on the table and they can say, whatever, we're going to ignore you. That's been something on my radar as well. How do we address that? How do we create transparency in our democracies that should be there and really isn't there right now?
Okay, well, if there's anything I can do to support your efforts in Australia, let me know.
Yes,
Thank you very much, Eric.
We are definitely willing to help in any way, shape, or form. Actually, Keely might be really good to talk to about some case studies. So, you know, maybe you guys can connect post Zoom recording. So,
yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for the time. I think we're all on the same side. I think we're always going to spar a little about the best way forward. That's okay. And I think everyone should push in the way that they feel best for anyone to get it. And I think the situation is different, perhaps on a country by country basis. And, you know, we'll see what happens with this biotoxin illness committee and whether that makes progress or not. And if not, we'll reevaluate, I guess. But it'd be good to keep in touch. And thank you for today.
We shall see. Great talking to you.
Thank you. Good. You too.
yeah,
Bye.
Here, you guys.
Yeah, these researchers, you really have to be firm with them, I tell you.
That was good. Oh, do you want me to do the recording, right? I'm sorry.
Wait, what?
You want me to do the closing, right?
You might as well just to have it in case you need it.
Yeah, because it's a bitch and a half to have to do it after the fact. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We had Caleb and Sean from Australia. They have a toxic mold group where they're helping people with CIRS diagnoses and mold injured individuals as well. And they have a lot of information on their site, and the Australian government looks like they're actually putting money into funding some studies. So we look forward to seeing what they do there, and maybe we can bring that over to the United States. Who knows? Again, we will keep that on our radar. Thank you again. Please like, share, comment on our content. Also, check out our GoFundMe and Patreon pages. Those of you that pledge to be one of our Patreon members. We have a lot of special content coming up just for you. So feel free to check that out and see if you would like to become a part of that. So thank you again. We'll see you next time.